Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Live Series. Today, we're wrapping up the one-to-one leadership portion. That perspective we covered in February, and next week we shift to one-to-many leadership. Think executive leadership, setting the climate for high performance. For the past month, we focused on one-to-one leadership. Team leadership, yes, but that leadership level happens one-to-one, and we'll talk about some of that today. Before that, we focused on agency, regulation, and personal leadership under pressure. Those are prerequisites to being able to detect and adjust the trajectory of those who are reporting to you. When I talk about managing and leading, and I may use the word employees, but it applies to associates. I recognize that there are many virtual assistants, there are associates, remote workers, there are people you may not even know, there are people who rotate through. It includes all of that. So today we talk about that inflection point. Dynamic leadership exists because the narrative has shifted. For decades, leadership development emphasized insight, motivation, and behavioral compliance. What we now understand is more fundamental. Performance is governed by patterned subconscious signaling, and those patterns are modifiable. That's the point. Until recently, it was widely accepted that people can't change, and that they don't change. Dynamic leadership provides the recipe to do just that. There are 3 levels of habit: behavioral habits, what you do; reactive habits, how you respond or actually react; and construct habits like identity, confidence, personality. And those were thought to be the most persistent. And in fact, in the early days of emotional intelligence, it was stated that intelligence is not going to change, personality is not going to change. But that was before we had the brain scanning tools available to see what's really going on. Most leadership work targets behavior. Meanwhile, automation is accelerating exponentially. We're now on the vertical portion of that technology curve, that scaling curve. You know, the one technology capability will double every 18 months. That's been going on for several decades now. This is where capability compounds rapidly because that part of the curve is vertical. Now, it may look like more of the same, just faster, but the reality is that it's more different than most people realize, much more. Consider advertising. Advertising has always influenced people to act in ways that they didn't initially intend. Everyone has experienced buying something and never using it. Critical thinking has traditionally helped protect against that influence, but automation now allows systems to leverage cognitive biases at unprecedented speed and precision. Here's an example. Before the year 2000, there was a stock newsletter company, and I lived through this. I watched it, but I didn't know what was going on at the time. They would send predictions to hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions. And only those who received correct predictions continued to receive updates. And that continued to scale to where they got that last group that had received several rounds, each with a correct prediction. So a subset of readers experienced multiple accurate predictions in a row. That's confirmation bias. It took hold. The source became credible in the subconscious, and trust formed automatically. It can take many incorrect predictions to break that credibility, yet it only takes a few correct ones every now and then to maintain it. It takes about 3 or 4 to establish it, intermittent to maintain it or sustain it, and it's very difficult to break it. Now, that company gained massive high-ticket subscriptions. Was it expensive for them? Yes. Was it valuable for the company? Certainly. For consumers, not always. And there are different variations of this, but that company was so successful, it was well beyond any other stock newsletter at the time. What does this have to do with leadership? Managers and leaders carry amplified influence inside organizations. In times of uncertainty and volatility, that influence increases because people look for certainty and direction. Confirmation bias is just one of dozens of cognitive biases shaping decisions every day. These biases operate before the conscious mind, often within fractions of a second, and the conscious mind then receives the reaction as the truth. Automation allows actors to compress these cycles dramatically. What once unfolded over months can now occur in hours or days. Imagine interacting with several ads for a product. Each click trains the system to deliver increasingly tailored messages to you. By the third or fourth interaction, perception shifts and desire feels internally generated, again, like truth, even though it was progressively shaped on purpose by an outside actor. Now, imagine that process applied not to products, but to narratives, ideologies, or perceptions about your organization or brand, or maybe something you believe. Conventional leadership approaches are too slow for this environment. Technology itself is neutral. Automation is not the problem, but accelerated systems amplify both positive and negative influence. Dynamic leadership addresses this reality by targeting the signaling patterns that generate behavior, first to build agency, and then to recognize patterns in others and adjust trajectory early, before cognitive biases and habit loops compound. And that's the major shift. To do this before cognitive biases come in, because they come in before the conscious mind is aware, and that's how they get perceived as truth. When you interrupt before the cognitive biases come online, you're able to disrupt that process that leads to a person incorrectly assuming that the reaction coming from the subconscious is truth. They recognize it for what it is. The implication is significant. If agency precedes influence, and influence precedes architecture, then sustained performance requires mastery at the signaling level, not just communication skill. This has always been something that would be valuable, and there are people who are using it. It's been used in sports, professional sports, for decades. Martial arts has used it. Special operations has used it because they understood it, but they applied it to the physical part, the physical activities, athletics. They didn't recognize that the neural pathways that activate muscles and what we think of as muscle memory, and it's actually nervous system memory, the neural pathways, while they may be different parts of the brain and the different parts of the central nervous system, but they behave the same way for cognitive experiences. In other words, the same way you can train muscle memory, you can train cognitive memory as well. As a matter of fact, the word cognitive is actually related to cognitive processing, which is actually physiological because it's the neural pathways, the myelin, the synapses, and the process of synaptogenesis. The energy going through the neural pathways, no, that's not physiological, but the neural pathways themselves and how a pathway or set of pathways become the path of least resistance, that's physiological. Emotional intelligence revealed the importance of regulation. Self-determination theory clarified intrinsic motivation. Dynamic leadership operationalizes both, but it does so upstream, inside the first few tenths of a second where trajectory is still adjustable. In a world of accelerating stimuli, internal recovery speed becomes the defining executive advantage, and that's why dynamic leadership now. As I go through a few of the principles, there are three things I want you to keep in mind as a leader or owner. First, agency versus influence. Where in your organization are decisions being shaped before awareness even begins? This might look like a reaction or some quick response or quick reaction, and you're understanding what's going on. You can see that this was not a conscious thought. It was a reaction to some past association or some past event. Second, stability versus adaptation. Are you stabilizing at your current level, assuming status quo moving forward? Or are you training your system to stabilize upward on an upward trajectory as external demands are increasing? External demands are on an upward trajectory. So homeostasis keeps us the same. That's stabilization at status quo. Allostasis allows upward stabilization, and this becomes critical when you think about onboarding and development plans, because next quarter is not going to be like last quarter. People are going to continue to have to improve their processes and level up and react to new things that weren't even conceived of just a few quarters ago. And the third one is the timing advantage. How early in the reaction cycle or sequence do you actually have influence? Is it seconds or fractions of a second? Most leadership training happens after reaction. It's working with the response level, and the response level is clearly in the conscious mind. Dynamic leadership works before the trajectory locks in. So we'll be talking about that. I'm going to go through fairly quickly, and because this is a wrap-up for the February to transition into March, there may be things that you've heard before, but I'll say them differently. Let's take a look at the slides. So why dynamic leadership and why now? I've covered this before, the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence, and this is foundational to dynamic leadership work. I am not replacing, I'm not competing with. This is about taking what we know in emotional intelligence and moving the action points, moving the levers upstream where you can gain much more, have much more impact, much more influence with much less effort because of the speed and the power of the network of neurons, aka subconscious. So those are the 4 pillars: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And it makes sense. This is about agency. This is about getting back to that agency even when you're surrounded by chaos. This is about being able to detect in others when they're being reactive versus when they're coherent. And then relationship management becomes adjusting the trajectory real time before it becomes a problem. And then we have self-determination theory. This is core to intrinsic motivation, autonomy. People have to have some freedom of action, and the more they can connect the dots between what they're doing and what they care about, the more likely they're going to maintain intrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic motivation is not just something coming from inside. They get pleasure from the activity itself, and so it becomes self-reinforcing. And so by making the work that they're doing, not by changing the work, but by helping them understand the connections, they're able to gain pleasure, reinforcing pleasure. I think of dopamine and serotonin from the work itself. And I talked about this before in the blue, red, and white language. That's how you drive some of that dopamine and serotonin that creates habitual patterns, so you don't have to be around to drive high performance. It becomes a habit. Competence, they have to see that they're competent. And this could be a slippery slope because there are some people who, they treat it like every mistake is a big problem. But think about it in school. You had a range from 70 to 100, and a person could get a 70 on an exam initially and end up with an A at the end because they worked through it. But if you're treating every 99% like it's a big problem, it's going to be harder for that person to feel and experience competence. So this is an important one as well for intrinsic motivation. And then the third one is relatedness. Now, these are not necessarily connected to emotional intelligence, but because they both have come out of human needs, there are going to be parallels. And that's why dynamic leadership, rather than reinventing the wheel, it looks at what's already there, what has been proven to work. And what dynamic leadership does is it makes it easier to do this earlier in the sequence. The benefit of doing it earlier in the sequence is massive. Leadership requires open skill performance. What I mean by this is that in sports, it's closed skill. You know the field, you know the rules of the game, you know who the opponent is. Leadership, you come in, you don't know what's going to happen. It could be something totally unrelated. There could be some massive thing that happens completely outside of you. Wildfires, earthquakes, tornadoes. It could be something more, it could be geopolitical. It could be some trade policy that changes. It could be some technology thing that causes disruption. You don't know what's going to come. So leadership requires an adaptability that, while it exists in sports, it's not the same, because in sports, this adaptability within a known frame. Leadership requires adaptability in an unknown frame, and because the unfamiliar is perceived as threat by the subconscious, that creates a double whammy. So we have to have this ability to not only handle the unforeseen, but to maintain agency during that process. So here's the habit inflection point that I'm talking about. Self-regulation is only half the equation. Leaders must also detect activation shifts in others. Why? And emotional intelligence speaks to this. But the leader clearly sets the climate. But it's also possible for the environment to have an impact on the leader. And when you are in stress response, you have cognitive narrowing. As that cognitive narrowing occurs, you enter into stress response. As you enter into stress response, you're giving off signals, obvious signals, facial expressions. We all know this. Sometimes we ignore them. Sometimes we pay attention to them and do something about it. But I would say that the general theme is people don't put enough of a premium on these early signals. Maybe not in terms of something shifted, but certainly in terms of how much more leverage you have early on. In other words, if you see a shift and you can see that what you said had a reaction, you have a choice. You can ignore it, you can deal with it early, you can deal with it later. And deal with it can mean just addressing it, asking a question. If you ignore it, whatever that was, it's going to keep signaling, because there's a need for that person to surface whatever is going on, right? It's an association from something before. If you wait, that thing could turn into something else. This is where people can catastrophize, because the thing that triggered that shift that you noticed, it noticed something from external. There was only one external cue. The next cue, if it's triggering, will come from inside. So now they're inside. This is when they say, if you're in your head, you're dead. Now they're inside reacting to their own reactions. And those reactions are becoming like more stimulus response, but it's actually stimulus reaction. And they have the potential to catastrophize. Not always, because they can catch it and come back out. But the value of addressing it early, because it's usually not related directly to what you said. What you said may have triggered the association, but because the association is from the past, it's really not relevant here. And by just getting a clarification, what's coming up for you? And I just want to pause here. Anybody have any thoughts? That person is going to come, right? They're going to say something because they have telling tension. That association usually will trigger the telling tension. And then you open the door for them to voice it, and they voice it, and you're able to answer it very quickly before the mob behavior of the neurons kicks in, and more associations occur. So every team member runs the same rapid appraisal cycle. We'll talk about that you do. That's why we start with yourself. We got to make sure that you're able to govern it or regulate in yourself. And regulation is three parts. It's prevention and near prevention. It's modulation, which happens in the middle. And then there's regulation, which tends to be corrective. Regulation is like correcting a skid after the car has already started skidding. Modulation would be like in the old days, pumping the brakes so you avoid the skid. Now we have anti-lock braking system, and it's doing what's called near prevention, because as soon as the tire starts to slide, it's releasing pressure on the brakes. You don't even notice it unless you're driving in the snow or on ice. Then you can feel the chugging of the brakes. But in normal circumstances, it's seamless. So that's near prevention. That's where dynamic leadership lives, in the near prevention stage, because you're correcting so quickly it looks like stability. The modulation is the second line of defense. If it gets through there, then we have the modulation piece. And by doing those two, you virtually eliminate the need for regulation. Emotional regulation I'm talking about in this case, because nothing is getting through there that triggers you. And we do that with a process that's repeatable and teachable and scalable. Now, this started with the 7 performance areas, and I'm going to work down from the 7 performance areas down to what executives are paying attention to. But this would apply to everyone. Mental, physical, and spiritual is on the side that we can control. Emotional is in the middle. This is where we can be hijacked. So it's the gateway to the right side. You notice on the bottom, it says be, do, have in faint letters. And that's because it's so easy to start with relationships, professional, financial. You're changing jobs or starting a business. What are you going to do? Who's your customer? Everybody's looking over here, when the first thing we have to do is have agency. And this is your identity. Once you get your identity reset, that's why I call it a reset, 7-step reset, because right now your identity is one that was largely formed from 0 to 7 with the conditioning and beliefs that you may not even have had a say in. And that's formed your identity over the years. By the time your prefrontal cortex is formed with the 20 billion neurons. That's 1/5 of the total neurons. That comes between age 19 and 27. You're basically locked in. I say the prefrontal cortex operationalizes your conditioning. And then from 35 on, it's basically 95% by habit. Now, that may be fine if that's the life you want, and I'm not knocking that at all. What I'm saying is if you have a quest or a purpose that's bigger than yourself, you have to reset your identity first. And so we take laps around this part to make sure we've got the identity that can handle whatever comes your way over here. And then we have an extended follow-up period so that when things do come in that throw you off course, you're able to recover quickly. That's like the anti-lock brakes, stopping the skid before it even happens. So this is the first part, and we're going to now cover how this applies to the homeostasis and allostasis. You've probably heard the word homeostasis. I would say far fewer people have heard of allostasis before. So homeostasis, you could think of it as stability at the status quo. So the brain and the nervous system, and this was not taught years ago, but the brain and the nervous system are actually prediction engines. They're constantly predicting what's going on and what can I anticipate. This is like the pre-listening. You walk into a room and you're automatically prepped for what could come as a stimulus or whatever, something you have to deal with. And when that prediction matches what's coming in, then the neurotransmitter production tends to be reduced because it's energy intensive and the brain is kind of stingy with that. This is one of the reasons why hacks don't work. If you think about a hack as something that gets you through the day, there might be some speaking hacks and it works for a while, but then it's like it doesn't work anymore and you need a new hack. And then you have a different hack and it works for a while. This happens a lot with habits. And so you're stabilizing along this homeostasis. It's very obvious in weightlifting because you hit plateaus. And each time you hit a plateau, it's a signal that the brain and nervous system have adjusted to the amount of demand coming in. This is why trainers will constantly have you changing up at 6 to 8 weeks because you want to get ahead of that. And what you want is allostasis. And with allostasis, you're getting stability, but it's on an upward trajectory. With this, it's the same thing. There's prediction, but whereas this, I was talking about hacks. Here, the brain and nervous system are predicting what's coming in, and it's thinking, okay, that's pretty cool, but then all of a sudden it increases again, and it thinks it has it, and then it increases again. You can see this on a through hiker, a hiker who's hiking, say, 90 days. A 90-day hike from border to border. And you'll see that in the beginning, they're maybe doing 10 miles per day. By the end of the hike, they can be doing 35 miles per day. That's more than a marathon every day, and they'll do this for 10, 15 days in a row. Their body adjusted. Their nervous system adjusted. And if you look at them, they don't look that much different than they did when they started. So it's not like it's all muscle change. As a matter of fact, if you look at some power lifters, there are power lifters who can lift large amounts of weight and they don't look big. Their signal, the nervous system signal is very strong. And the way that allostasis works is there's several factors: novelty and tension, precision and balance, progression, intensity, and struggle at the edge of ability. Some of those are also apply to deep practice, which is how we create myelin. Myelin and synapses, or synaptogenesis, the process of putting synapses into the pathways, is essentially how neuroplasticity happens. So we know from neuroplasticity that the brain is malleable, that the brain you die with does not have to be the brain you were born with, which is why we say you can change, and it's actually easier than people thought, because what we're going to do is use neuroplasticity to make those changes happen, as opposed to willpower or discipline. And willpower and discipline, it has its limitations. This is important for leaders because too many leaders let the onboarding process be dictated by HR. And there's nothing against HR, but HR has a different reason for their onboarding. They have a different objective. Their objectives have to do with avoiding lawsuits and making sure that they're following the rules and the laws and the regulations. But if you separate it and look at a sports team is also going to have some kind of an onboarding. They'll have an onboarding. Here's your locker. Here's how you get paid. Here's what you do about uniform changes. And here's the policies and procedures. And then that player goes out and meets with the coaches, and there's a different kind of onboarding. That second onboarding with the coaches has to do with the play, the games, the performance, what the expectations are on the field, the nature of the competition, all of those things. And it's going to be setting the stage for that player to function at a high performance as the season unfolds. When you think about onboarding and leadership development, employee development, we need to think about onboarding in two parts. One is the onboarding that HR does, which is really just the orientation type thing, and then the real onboarding. And I talk about onboarding as setting up a development plan over 2 years, because we can set it up for this longer thing. It's out of scope for today, but when we start giving praise and reprimands, it's in the context of where they are in their development plan and how progress is moving. So there's always more to come. You're always signaling to the central nervous system and the brain that there's more to come. It's not that they arrive. They don't arrive, because there's always more. And you set that up in the onboarding with the 90 days, because there's certain things that they have to learn just to get along with the teams and function, etc. And then there's that 90 days sets the stage for the 2 years. And the reason I use 2 years is because typically at that point there may be a new assignment, or maybe a promotion or something like that. Whether there is or not, you start another 2-year plan. Now, for the new employee, somebody straight out of college, there may be 8 different modules, 1 module per quarter. For an executive, there may only be 2 modules for the whole 2 years. It just depends. But the point, and maybe within those modules, you have certain checkpoints that they've got to hit. But you want to know that people can handle certain things. And remember, open skill environment, you can be hit with anything at any time. So while we're not going to manufacture crisis to learn these behaviors, what you can do is create innovations that people, and projects, many projects that people have to work through. And a lot of those same skills that are used in a crisis are used in an innovation. Think about it. A crisis, you're closing the gap of a problem. You're closing from here to there. You're closing that gap with a project or some initiative. With the crisis and a project, you're doing the same thing. Now, so that was a story about why allostasis is important, especially now, because the rapid change is not going to go away. It's going to continue. And by having an upward trajectory, you're more likely to stay on pace. So here's a quick recap of that, something you could do a screenshot of to take what I just now said and put some words behind it or some structure. So there's your allostasis versus homeostasis. Homeostasis stabilizes at the status quo. Plateaus are predicted demand, and it's about the signal, the neural pathway signal, more so than the muscle in terms of physiology. But in certain terms of cognitive, the plateaus are about the signal, not necessarily what you know. This is why, I say to know and not do is not that much better than not knowing. So most people are performing far below what they know. They're utilizing far less than what they know. Allostasis stabilizes upward, so you're constantly signaling to the system that it has to level up. Demand exceeds prediction, and there are 7 drivers. This is what I mentioned: novelty, intention, precision, complexity in cognitive activity, balance in physical activity, progression, intensity bursts. That's in cognitive. In physiology, it would be explosiveness, and then struggle at the edge of ability. Struggle at the edge of ability, novelty and intention and precision are real important for deep practice. So when you start thinking about neuroplasticity and changing habits, that's where we'll be spending time. So continuous improvement requires nervous system alignment. You don't want to be behind. You don't want to be catching up. You want to be pacing with the rate of change. The next one I want to look at is the 7-step reset. 7-step reset, these steps absorb the thousands of stimulus response cycles we have per day. So we're constantly being bombarded by external stimulus or stimuli, and then internally we react to our own stimuli. The research tells us that there's over 30,000 of these per day on average. So clearly some people have more, some people have less. if you look at if just do it from a math standpoint, just make the assumption that, okay, 30,000 to 33,000 is what it is, and you're awake roughly 65,000 seconds a day. You can say that over a period of time you have X number of stimulus response cycles, and these are about 1 to 2 seconds apart because it's every other second. And then it processes. Now, some of these are benign. Some of these are just, oh, I saw that, I'm going to do this. I thought about that, I've got to do this. They're just minor. Some you ignore, some you act on, some you delay, some you make a note, whatever. When you get out of coherence, when you are not fully present, then you have the risk of, instead of having them spaced out like this, what you're doing is getting internal reaction cycles inside that 2 seconds. And when that happens, you can see where this leads to a person escalating, being triggered, catastrophizing, because there may have only been one external stimulus. But then once they start internalizing and looking inside and letting the associations run rampant, this is what you get. This would be a spike. And that spike is going to last for a period of time. Without agency, without the ability to return to coherence, a growth mindset, without the ability to manage that real time, this thing can extend for a long period of time. What we want is for this to recover quickly and get back to coherence and presence and mindfulness. This is what we do in the 7-step reset. It's catching this early, way before the person is even aware of it consciously. By catching it early, you have much greater opportunity to address it because you have more leverage. The earlier you are in the process, the more leverage you have and more influence, and it takes less effort. And not only that, this doesn't just continue. It could escalate. It could just keep escalating. And what we want to do is bring it back to this coherence. This is essentially what's happening with the reactive habits, which is why they're so hard to change. And reactive habits is one of the reasons why dynamic leadership is so important, because if you went to your team and you said, hey, we're going to do this training, it's going to be, you're going to learn this and this and this. This is so true with salespeople as well. And the reaction will be, we don't need the training. I already know that stuff. I know everything there. But then if you step back and say, but to know and not do is like not knowing. And then you look at where are they not knowing it. Because if you had a player on a sports team who folded under pressure, you wouldn't say that they forgot how to play. You would say that they're not able to regulate in those high stress situations. So when the employee says to you or the leader says to you that I already know that, I don't need this training, you have to be thinking there's a level of understanding that's missing because they're still behaving in a reactive way. If they're behaving reactively, they're not able to access what they know because the cognitive narrowing that happens when a person enters into fight or flight. And then if that stays too long and you're getting this, then what you have is the cortisol and adrenaline. It becomes a neurobiological event at that point. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do this in 2 seconds, but you certainly don't want it to last for days. And when we talk about the 7 performance areas, this is what we're doing. We're making sure that the person has the ability to recover quickly. That's why we spend time in the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. So the 7-step reset, this is what's going on 33,000 times a day. And the focus is for stability and rapid recovery that's happening so fast that it looks like nothing ever happened. We're going from step 7, 1, and then 2. 7, 1, 2. Because this is where we return to presence and mindfulness. This is where we're able to access what we know. And step 2 is making sure that we have coherence so we're not acting out of rigidity and chaos because another stimulus is coming. And remember what I was talking about, how fast this is all coming at us. You don't have the luxury of waiting to reset. This is why you have people online, the young folks now, they call it crashing out. You have people crashing out, and these crash outs will last for sometimes hours, and they just can't get a hold of themselves, and no rational information coming from the outside is going to help because they're so focused on what's going internally. So we have 2 emotional modulation steps in this 7-step. One is here, step 5, and this is the major one because we don't know here. We don't know what the next stimulus is going to be. Once the stimulus happens, it formulates a reaction, hands it off to the conscious mind for the response. But when you're in stress, that response often equals the reaction, which is not good because the reaction is based on past, right? It's associations, it's what's worked in the past. It's not from a present standpoint, it's from associations in the neural pathways. If that comes across and there's an emotional blip, that communicates to you that you need to do an emotional modulation quick, 10, 15, 30 seconds, something less than 90 seconds. Eventually this becomes habitual. You'll automatically just emotionally modulate. In the beginning you may take the full 60 or 90 seconds, but then it becomes habitual. And you do that before you take action. Too often people go from stimulus to triggered. Triggered makes the reaction the response, and then that leads to action, and now they're taking action in an emotionally unstable state. So not only do we have to modulate here so that we return to mindfulness and presence, here when you're just doing a check-in, do I have coherence? Am I being present? You may have to modulate here. So when a person who typically has a growth mindset, but they get into a stress response and now they have a fixed mindset, they have to catch that here. So growth and fixed mindset is not just about I have a growth mindset. It's about getting back to a growth mindset in milliseconds, not hours, not days, but in you've got to get back there fast. This is like anti-lock brakes versus letting the skid happen and trying to correct it. Or like traction control, same thing. It's acting early enough in the process because you're doing it at the pace of stimulus reaction, which is a lot faster than stimulus response because the response is conscious mind, and the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second. A lot's going on in that first half second. People think that, it's just a delay, it's just the slow. No, there's a lot going on in the first quarter of a second and a lot going on in the second quarter of a second, and that forms the reaction that gets handed off to the conscious mind for a response, and that handoff converts the signal that's going through the network of neurons, because that's not interpreted by the conscious mind, it's an impulse. It converts it to something that can be perceived by the conscious mind. Maybe it's a sensation, maybe it's a thought, could be an emotion, a feeling, but something gets handed off to the conscious mind that can be perceived, and then that's where the response should occur. And we condition all that in. This is not something that you're doing actively. You're learning to do it on easy things, so you're building the conditioning. So the same way the automaticity works based on how you were from 0 to 7, you're shifting it so the automaticity works that's in a way aligned with your quest or your purpose. So the 7-step reset, recovery as a performance multiplier. Rather than focusing on stability, what we're focusing on is rapid recovery. Rapid recovery at the millisecond level. That's why it has to be conditioned in, because the conscious mind is not operating at milliseconds. It's 50 bits per second is like the speed of the conscious mind, whereas the network of neurons, because energy is flowing through the pathways, and there's trillions of connections, so energy is flowing through trillions of connections, and that's why the processing speed over there is 11 million bits per second. So you want to interrupt the pattern, return to presence, restore coherence, and then emotional modulation before escalation. So that could be happening at step 2 or step 5, because you want fast recovery. Fast recovery prevents reaction stacking and preserves cognitive bandwidth. An example of reaction stacking: suppose a person is faced with a crisis and they have 3 options, and all 3 of those options are suboptimal. They don't like either one of them. And they start thinking about what's going to happen on the first option, and they don't like it, and they're thinking, and remember, the network of neurons, aka subconscious, doesn't understand, and it thinks of everything as a Serengeti tiger. And you have the network of neurons now saying that's a bad thing, it creates some fight or flight. Option 2 is bad, creates some more fight or flight. Option 3 is bad, it creates some more fight or flight, but they stack. It's like all 3 options are stacking, but all 3 options are not going to happen at the same time. You're doing one or the other, but yet the person is catastrophizing as though all of this is coming at them at one time. So that's an example. That's a visual you can have. And if most people have experienced this, And what you want to do is notice it in others before it happens. And that's where we're going to go next. In the next area, I'll talk about the power of the first 600 milliseconds. Why 600? Because the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second. And so that's a half second that the subconscious, aka network of neurons, is processing. But before that, there's a pre-listening period that's about 1/10 of a second. And that's where I get the 600 milliseconds. But in that 600 milliseconds, there's automaticity happening based on your conditioning from 0 to 7. What we do with dynamic leadership is we recondition it using the 7-step reset. You recondition it. It's not something I do to you. You look at your quest, you look at your needs, and you make adjustments with practicing exercises. And those exercises recondition. The same way they have race car drivers doing things with catching a ball and throwing the ball and switching hands, and then having to put balls, when they catch a different color ball, having to put it in a different hole because they're increasing their reaction time. The point is you can improve upon what we were handed off from our 0 to 7 conditioning and our operationalizing with the prefrontal cortex. You can improve that, and that's what we do with dynamic leadership, but specifically for agency and personal leadership. So this one, you have this pre-listening period out here, about 1/10 of a second, and then you have 500 milliseconds, so this gives you your 600, and then you have a handoff to the conscious mind. So this over here is pre-conscious, and this is conscious. This is the network of neurons. This is the conscious mind. Network of neurons, physiological, 100 billion neurons, energy pulsing through those neural pathways, synapses connecting the neurons. Neurons get wrapped with myelin, and that makes them habits, and habits become the path of least resistance. And in this period, you have basically 3 sections. You have the first 2/10 of a second, second 2/10 of a second, and third 2/10 of a second. And in each one of these, you have opportunities to make a change. And there you have opportunities to make a change. So just quick examples, you can do perpetual question change. Here you can use breathing. You can use attention shifts. You can use a signal. Here you can use anchoring, some kind of an anchor that brings you back to a coherent state. And that's a big part of this. A big factor is influence, high. Effort, low. Over here. Over here, in the conscious mind, influence, low. This is why we believe for so many years and decades that you can't change habits. Effort, high. If you do change, it's a lot of effort. But when you understand the neuroplasticity and doing it over here, the effort goes way, way down because you have all this leverage. You're interacting in milliseconds, so you're stopping some of this scaling that's going up, and you're putting the automaticity to work for you in favor of what you're doing. So we talked about 3 different kinds of habits. We said there's behavior, there's reactive, and there's constructs. Behavior, if you start with behavior, you'll always be fighting an uphill battle. If you start with constructs, it's almost impossible because a personality is a construct. How do you change a personality at the construct level? You don't. You have to change it at the elements level. The same way in sports. If a person wants to learn a new move, they don't start at the macro side of the move. The coach will break it down into small parts, and then they put them together, and that's the move. It's the same way with personality, with identity, with confidence. If you try to have confidence and start with the construct, you'll use hacks and things like that. You'll fake it till you make it doing these things, but you never know when you're going to get knocked back into old patterns. By changing it at the elements level, using neuroplasticity, you now can change this, and that's why we start with this 7 performance areas, because we're updating this. Now, it doesn't happen all at once. It's an allostasis thing, right? You're going to have some of this, but as you're doing this, you can start moving in towards your quest, find out new weak links, improve those weak links. Reactive, this one we definitely need to get to, because if a person gets reactive, they have the cognitive narrowing. Once the cognitive narrowing happens, they have less access to their capabilities. The cognitive narrowing happens, and they have less access to their abilities. This gets back to to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. By correcting this, and when I say correcting, what you're doing is giving them the ability to find stability through rapid recovery. So they don't keep reacting and let the reaction become another reaction. They have tools to interrupt it. And that's where it starts. In the beginning, it's interrupting the reaction and redirecting. Later, the reaction doesn't happen because their identity is such and the neuroplasticity is such that they no longer get triggered by things from the past. They recognize it's something from the past. They're able to modulate. And you're not doing it by conscious mind. You're doing it when you feel that thing coming up. So if you've been in a situation where you have some telling tension, you know that you feel that telling tension come up and you can feel it. It starts rising. If you're talking to somebody and they have telling tension, you can spot it. You can see that telling tension start to rise up. That's when you start using your modulation skills. We don't wait. This is when Malcolm Gladwell in the book Blink talked about thin slicing. The people would know something, but they don't know how they know it. But I would bet if you could go back into those studies that he was doing, you would see that they had some sort of a sensation coming up because it's it's neurobiological. This energy going through the neural pathways, that's physiological. So you feel it. And when you feel it, you may not know what it is, but you know that this is a good feeling or a bad feeling. You'll learn that too. I mean, excitement and anxiety have a similar signature, but you'll know which one it is. And that's another part of this process, is because you don't want something you're excited about leading to activating anxiety. And that's kind of what happens when a person chokes, in a way. They're excited about the fact that they may win, and next thing you know, and this, people say don't jinx it. Next thing you know, they're causing anxiety because those two things are so close together. So you have to learn the distinctions, and there's tools available to you. But if you look at it all and you say this is all about neuroplasticity, and you start understanding neuroplasticity, then you can start applying your shifts. This is what I was talking about. This would be your 7 phases of the 1 second. This is what happens in 1 second. Now, we don't start here because if I started here, it would be very difficult to grasp this, because every time you start thinking about it, learning about it, or engaging with it, you think of all these things. Like already you're probably, your mind goes off. Wait, what about this? Because there's triggering associations. There's that pre-listening. This is the initial detection. This is the rapid appraisal. This is all that first 600 milliseconds right here. And then it hands off to the conscious mind. You have conscious engagement. And this pause that we put in here, that pause is less than a quarter of a second. But if you get triggered over here and you're reactive, you can't pause. People say, I tried to pause, but I can't. Yeah, they try to pause when they're already reacting. If you can redirect the reacting, then you can pause. And again, we condition it in, because what's a quarter of a second is not going to hurt you. But it can work wonders if you're recognizing in the conscious mind that what's coming across is a reaction and has nothing to do with what I'm dealing with right now. And then over here, at the 1 second mark. So you're not really extending it much. You're going from a reaction time that happens at a half second to maybe going to 3/4 of a second instead of a half second before you respond. But you also have the ability now, we've conditioned in that check to see, do I need to modulate my emotions? Am I in a productive emotional state to take action? And if you're not, that's where we take that next 60 seconds to 90 seconds, and eventually that will become a conditioned process as well. So this is what I'm talking about. Here's the 600 milliseconds. Like I said in the beginning, this first 2/10, perpetual question. Instead of am I safe, it could be something like, what's my best course of action? What else is involved? What's the analysis? What's the 2-axis framework I can draw? Whatever you can change your perpetual question to, so it's not priming you for what's bad, dangerous, or scary. Then in this one you have this is where we use mainly a positivity exercise to train the subconscious to not bias towards risk or threat. We literally train it, because right now it's coming from the hunter-gatherer evolution. Think about it, hunter-gatherers, humans existed as hunter-gatherers for thousands and thousands of years. We've only been interacting with automobiles and things like that for a couple of centuries. That bias towards threat made sense for a hunter-gatherer. But you can't have a bias that every single impulse that comes in is threat, or you're going to be reacting and you're going to be getting triggered and you're going to be crashing out, as they say. So we retrain it. So instead of 80 or 90% of the stimuli coming through as potential threat, you'll see 10 or 20% come through as potential threat. And that's going to reduce greatly your cognitive narrowing and your seeing things as danger or threat. And then by the third 2/10, you have mobilization. Here's where it's best to have some kind of a pre-trained anchor, something where you can get right back to calm quickly, because you're losing the leverage. This thing is like an arc in terms of your effort. The amount of effort is very low over here. It starts to rise. And then by the time you get to the conscious mind side, effort is very high. Your influence is very high over here, and it starts to drop. And then by the time you get to the conscious mind side, it drops drastically. And here you want to catch it with an anchor, pre-trained. Breathing helps here and here, especially if you practice box breathing. And then when you feel that sensation coming up, just take an inhale, a 1 or 2 second inhale and a slow exhale. And that'll give you, it forces that pause. It literally forces the pause with breathing. But if you wait until you're reacting to practice this and put it in place, it's not going to happen. We need to condition these things in so it's happening before you're aware. By the time you're aware that the sensation is happening, it's often too late. You want the same system that's signaling to be the system that does the correcting. So here's the first 600 milliseconds. This is where leadership leverage is the greatest, the pre-listening phase and subconscious prediction. So you have high impact, low effort, and then the late phase in conscious mind is high effort, low impact. This is what we're doing. This is where dynamic leadership lives. It lives up here. So it's taking the research that we have from emotional intelligence and from self-determination theory and books like Multipliers and Good to Great and Great by Choice and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and we're automating it. We're automating the best practices to become habits using neuroplasticity. Rapid self-recovery requires early detection in yourself and others, and it prevents reactions from becoming culture. You'll see those, and you won't wait anymore. Once you understand and have experienced this, you won't wait to deal with things that come up. And this, I draw this to depict above the line. There's a lot of resistance to getting above the line. You're in your comfort zone, and then we have to get through this barrier. And this barrier is what kicks people back, because it's stories, it's bad experiences, it's habit patterns. All of these things serve to push us back, but there is a process, and that process is agency and personal leadership and becoming very, very good at rapid recovery. When you get good at rapid recovery, you can get through this. Then you have a new problem. Up here, you have the unfamiliar and the unknown, whereas down here, you're used to living by habit. And up here, you are going to live by principles and near principles. You're going to use proven practices, and you build those in. You condition yourself to do those, so you're not chasing shiny things. And the VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, assures us that there will always be something to chase. Opportunities, you don't need to chase every opportunity, and you don't need to react to every threat. And by having that agency and personal leadership, you're able to do this, and then you can be applying methodical simplicity and consistency aligned with your strengths. And this is how you make progress on your quest, your purpose, and your vision. So I go live. I'll be going live weekdays in the morning. Wednesdays in March, we'll have an Ask Me Anything. We'll start doing some roundtable discussions with leaders and owners. So that's it. I will close it out here.